Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event for the release of our news report, Harm to Table, Vulnerability and Exploitation in Los Angeles County Meatpacking and Food Processing. My name is Elda Solomon, and I'm a senior research analyst at the UCLA Labor Center. We are so thrilled to share this new report, which examines the realities of the meatpacking and food processing industry here in Los Angeles. We have a really exciting and great event planned for you this morning that bridges research, worker experience, and public health perspectives. We'll start with a short, powerful video that highlights the main findings from the report. Then, my colleague, Brian Justy, will present our key research findings. After that, we'll move into a panel discussion featuring workers, organizers, researchers, and public health experts. And finally, we'll close with an audience Q&A and some additional reflections from our panelists. Before we begin, I wanted to share a quick note about the UCLA Labor Center. The Labor Center develops research, education, and policy initiatives that aim to create good jobs for workers and their communities, improve job quality in the low-wage economy, and support immigrant integration, especially among students and youth. Through our work, we strive to ensure that all workers, especially those in low-wage and essential industries, have a voice and access to good, safe, and dignified work. If you'd like to learn more about the Labor Center, you can visit our website at labor.ucla.edu. Before we get into the discussion, we wanted to share something we're really excited about. We were fortunate to partner with Blueville Films to produce a short video that captures the heart of this research project, the stories, voices, and realities behind the data. This is a really special event because it's actually the premiere of the video, so we hope you really enjoy it.
Over the last several decades, corporate consolidations and deregulation in the meatpacking and food processing industry have transformed the national and local landscape, with the largest firms becoming more powerful and realizing record profits in recent years.
You see all of these food products at the grocery store, in restaurants, and you never really know the story behind it.
Los Angeles County and the industrial city of Vernon in particular has been a regional hotspot for meatpacking and food processing for more than a century. But over the last 2 decades, local unionized processing facilities have either shut down operations or left town, leaving thousands of predominantly immigrant workers forced to navigate precarious employment.
We hear about discrimination, dangerous working conditions, wage theft, all sorts of hardships that they go through to put these products on our plates.
Through a broad industry analysis and direct testimony from nearly 50 workers, we learned how staffing agencies shield food production companies from legal and political scrutiny while sustaining an industry defined by chronic low wages and systemic wage theft. Workers at food processing facilities are often unable to take full meal and rest breaks, and they frequently have issues getting paid in full and on time. Workers report a culture of harassment and discrimination from management on the production line.
Trabajo en la industria de la comida, desempeñamos el trabajo en línea, sirviendo el plato o poniendo el pollo y la banda va pasando. A veces no tenemos todo lo adecuado para estar uno bien trabajando, que hay mucho calor, el tiempo de break es corto, 10 minutos, a veces uno come apenas. Créeme lo que sí, es un estrés bastante fuerte.
Heightened competition for market share in the food production sector has produced a race to the bottom, as firms aim to bolster their profit margins by reducing labor costs, maintaining substandard working conditions, and undermining collective bargaining efforts.
Consolidation in the food production industry has meant that profits are concentrated higher up the national and international supply chain. Exactly what we've seen on the local level here in Vernon, where smaller local and regional businesses are forced to shut down, displacing thousands and thousands of workers.
These economic pressures have led to the emergence of a new model of employment in the local sector.
One of the most shocking things we learned throughout this research was actually how staffing agencies effectively provide cover for food production companies, ensuring that harms against workers go undetected.
Temporary staffing agencies create additional layers of insulation between employers and regulators, allowing bad actors to break the law with impunity.
In LA County, there have been several operations committing egregious wage violations and even employing child labor who have been caught, fined, or shut down only to set up a new facility with a new corporate structure and a new staffing agency in place, which basically forces the regulators to start from scratch in terms of investigating wrongdoing.
Poultry workers, who are paid per piece of chicken cut rather than per hour worked, are paid less than the minimum wage.
To make the equivalent of a minimum wage, they need to cut 200 pounds of chicken per hour. So you can see that while piece rate is not illegal, it does lead to systemic wage violation.
Management routinely prioritizes speed over safety, creating a dangerous work environment exacerbated by a lack of standardized training.
What I hear most commonly from workers is the stress that this work puts on their body, right? They work on production lines, on assembly lines that operate at really high speeds. They're doing repetitive motion for the entirety of their shift, day after day, week after week, which causes a lot of pain. And sometimes these are injuries that workers can't recover from and they have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Such unsafe conditions directly correlate with substandard food safety protocols, posing a real threat to consumers.
Tienes que tener cuidado. Una silla estaba mal puesta y yo la levanté con mi mano y me apretó mi dedo contra la banda. No me dieron la opción de ir al médico, que querían que llegara a trabajar.
Without significant policy reform, the local meatpacking and food processing sector will remain dominated by low-road employers.
LA County has a food supply chain that, above all, competes on cost, meaning that the bottom line is all important. The health and safety of workers and consumers is essentially an afterthought.
But there are opportunities for immediate action to right these wrongs, including the prohibition of piece rate compensation in food production, as well as the expansion of capacity of regulatory agencies to enforce existing laws.
Garment workers in Los Angeles, for example, successfully organized a campaign over many years, and in 2023, a law was passed prohibiting piece rate pay in that sector. Similar efforts, I think, should be made in food production to finally put an end to systemic wage theft.
Establishing a worker center in Vernon and building a coalition with local and regional advocates across food justice, education equity, and animal welfare will lay the groundwork for a campaign to rebuild the high-road food supply chain in Los Angeles County.
If I had the power to change this industry, there's a lot that would have to change. And I think the first step is to uplift the workers' voices and to hear directly from them.
Now, to help us dig a little deeper into the findings, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Brian Justy, Senior Research Analyst and co-author of the report, who will walk us through some of the key takeaways from Farm to Table. Brian.
Thank you, Elda, and good morning, everyone. Very excited to finally have this report released. I think it represents a heroic effort on the part of many individuals and organizations to get this both research conducted and then written up and published into the world, hopefully with some impact. So to start, I want to discuss our methodology a little bit before I get into the findings for two kind of key reasons. The first, I think, something that's novel about this project is how at every stage of the process, it really was shaped and guided by workers themselves. We held a number of engagement sessions with workers in Vernon, where a lot of these plants are located, to share preliminary findings, help to sort of shape our research instruments along the way, and ultimately to ground truth a lot of the data that we were working with to ensure that it actually reflected the experience of the workers. And the second key piece of our methodological approach, I think, was a sort of dynamic approach, again, driven by workers, but really reflecting the nature of this industry. As we learned early on from workers, a lot of their experience is not actually reflected in pre-existing data sets. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but that's largely due to the role of staffing agencies in this industry. And so in terms of both government data like census data and other economic data sets, as well as OSHA data, you have on the one hand the food production companies who are maybe the name brands or stores that we recognize, totally removed from the employer of record, because the staffing agency is actually the one who is employing the workers. And it's much more challenging to track things when you have the staffing agency in the middle, which, yeah, posed some problems for us along the way. But I think that we got creative and, we're able to sort of make some I think strong claims despite the opaque nature of this industry. And so I'm going to move on to the findings, but ultimately, I think the key data here was uh, direct testimony from 47 workers through interviews and focus groups, which is a lot of what we're presenting in the report itself. So to begin, the first finding, which was mentioned in the video, is just that this industry really is defined by systematic wage theft. And I think the word systematic is important here. This isn't merely bad actors. While they exist, there are a number of sort of overarching structural factors that create conditions in this industry that lead to ongoing wage theft that either goes undetected or unpunished, even when it's found by regulators. So this includes things like late and withheld paychecks and meal and rest break violations, as well as workers having to pay for gear or equipment, personal protective equipment that doesn't get reimbursed by employers. But then on top of that, something interesting that we found was because poultry workers in particular are paid per piece rather than per hour, this is a system that is not illegal per se, but does very, very often lead to forms of wage theft in that the labor code does specifically prohibit. But just given the nature of piece rate, there's just the systemic cycle where workers are sort of caught and have very little recourse for addressing this. Next, something we found that is connected to the question of wage theft and to what I'm going to get to in a second. I already alluded to the role of staffing agencies, but we found hiring practices in this industry that were rampant that ultimately exploit already the most marginalized and vulnerable workers. Um, we know that this workforce is largely composed of immigrants, but these workers also are recruited often through informal networks, sometimes familial or social. But they're maintained through this sort of opaque and sometimes shady network of staffing agencies who are sort of shuffling around workers who were once employed in good union jobs. You know, they knew where they'd show up to work. They had the same shop floor each day, each week, each month. Now they're being moved around sometimes at will or sometimes unpredictably and with no advance warning. Related to that, there is very little sort of standardized practice around the documentation of wages and hours, something that the labor code does specifically require. This again is one of the sort of underlying, I think, building blocks of systemic wage theft. And finally, we found ample evidence that often, if employment contracts were provided, which was not always the case, there were very frequent language access issues. Contracts were being provided in a language that the workers didn't understand. And both of these two preceding findings, as we learned early on in this research, although we went in not expecting this, these things are exacerbated by staffing agencies, by temporary staffing agencies. Um, in our research, which I can get maybe more into in the Q&A if folks are interested, but there's this very expansive network of agencies, some of which are quite large and national outlets, some of which are local and seem to be sort of pop-up shops dedicated to single food production companies. Um, we dug through a lot of business data in terms of finding companies that had very sort of generic sounding names that were changing often. Um, and what we ultimately found was the role that staffing agencies play is a sort of middleman that ultimately shields the food production companies from scrutiny, maybe by regulators or organizers, as well as from liability. The employer of record is often not the food company, but the staffing agency, which sort of changes the nature of how one can enforce existing labor protections. These staffing agencies also allow the food production companies to flex their pool of workers, either seasonally or with boom and bust cycles of this industry, which keeps workers in this very precarious position where they have work until they don't, and then they're thrust back into this sort of opaque network. And, we heard from workers, they're calling around, calling different agencies, waiting to call back, maybe going weeks or months without hearing anything, and then one day get a call and are told to show up to work at a new food production company. And I guess finally, these agencies, well, in name alone, they are temporary. Often workers are stuck in the same positions for years or even decades, what's been called permatemp work. And so there's very little career advancement opportunity. And the agencies sort of keep workers in this kind of like intermittent stage at all times. Next, on the shop floor, we heard from many workers that there's just a widespread culture of retaliation and harassment, verbal abuse from supervisors that leads to a fear of retaliation. There's often workers feel afraid or uncertain about speaking up against very clear violations or harms. We heard a lot about how certain demographic characteristics of workers um, are discriminated against and create certain sort of practices of favoritism around promotion, especially. This promotion in some cases leads to, a bunch of workers working on a line. The line lead is picked based on favoritism, and then this person is afforded a lot of power and protection from management, which then ultimately creates a certain tension or resentment between colleagues. And the workers we spoke to said that this felt very deliberate often. Next, on the line, we heard from pretty much ubiquitously across different components within meatpacking and food processing that the work is just very dangerous, plain and simple. Often management at the corporate level or the line leads are imposing production quotas that are just completely unrealistic. There's usually unilateral control over the speed of the line. And so we heard from many workers about line speed kept coming up. This is the thing that sort of dictates what their work actually looks like, how they're able to collaborate or not with their colleagues. And I guess ultimately we kept hearing just that above all, speed is prioritized over safety. This is sort of amplified when all of the job training that happens is on the job. So folks are thrust into this, already dangerous line of work and then forced to learn on the job at very high speeds. And it's, a very high stakes game. There's lots of sharp objects, slippery floors, hot surfaces, cold surfaces, heavy objects to lift, etc. And finally, I think something that ultimately proved to be a very compelling piece of this research is just the direct through line between working conditions and I guess you could call it consuming conditions, or something that ultimately links the worker and the consumer together here. We found that substandard working conditions lead directly to worse food safety outcomes. Workers would report, clear violations, things that should very clearly not be, put into packaging and served, and management just sort of turning a blind eye, regulators turning a blind eye. Um, and ultimately, there just being a sort of a culture of food safety negligence, largely because of the sort of overwhelming demands of the job. And I think everyone racing to meet quotas at the the work, the workers on the line, but all the way up to the management. I think everyone is sort of squeezed here, and it just creates a system that leads to, potentially dangerous food safety outcomes. And finally, we made a series of recommendations at the end of this report based on our research, primary data, our industry analysis, and a lot of input from policy experts. And we lumped these recommendations into two buckets. The first was opportunities for immediate action, and the next were more sort of long-term strategic considerations. And so I think we'll be talking a bit about more about this in the panel, but a few of the opportunities for immediate action were to establish a worker center in Vernon. Unions used to be very present in this area, and one by one union shops have closed or been shut down. And I think there's kind of a void now where there's a clear need for some infrastructure to support workers. And I think a worker center, this has been proven in many other sectors, can play exactly that role. Another would be to prohibit piece rate in food production. As the video mentioned, this garment production was once defined by piece rate, which led to very similar outcomes for workers and wage theft. And only after a very long campaign did they eliminate piece rate. They made it illegal, and this has led to considerable changes in the industry. And finally, expanding language access for employment contracts in the labor code. The labor code doesn't yet actually require employment contracts to be offered in a language spoken or understood by workers. And I think this would create greater transparency in this industry in particular, but many others as well. And then expanding our purview a bit, and speaking to folks who have worked in other sectors or who have worked in food production elsewhere across the country, we heard time and again that it really requires identifying and working with champion advocates in local policy positions and administrative positions. So I think continuing to build the coalition that way. Demanding more transparency in the food supply chain. I think specifically around the role of staffing agencies. We have accounts of this in the report, but we heard even more that didn't make it into the report of just the ways that staffing agencies will pop up, to support or to provide workers for employers who are very clearly breaking the law. Those employers get caught breaking the law, get temporarily shut down. They, establish a new business. And it becomes a game of cat and mouse with regulators. But there'd be, I think, some ways that over time you can sort of claw some of the transparency back and prevent this very clear sort of, whack-a-mole system from being standard. And then finally, I mentioned the garment industry, but there are others as well. I think food production and meat packing in particular, I think, can learn a lot from other similar sectors, both locally and across the country. Um, but yeah, I will leave it there and pass it back to Elda. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Brian, for leading us through so many powerful findings. We're looking forward to hearing more from you. And now we want to take a deeper dive into the implication of these findings by hearing directly from Brian and other panelists and workers who are organizing and advocating in this industry. We're very fortunate to have an incredible group of panelists with us today. First, we have Perla Rosales, who brings a decade of experience in the meatpacking industry. She was recently elected to the executive board at UFCW Local 770 as a vice president after beginning her union journey as a shop steward and a member of the Health and Safety Committee. Perla has seen firsthand how critical it is for workers to feel safe and supported on the job and continues to fight for safer workplaces, fair wages, and stronger benefits for all workers. Next, we have Edgar Reyes, a public health council organizer with the Center for Training and Leadership, El Centro. Edgar is a dedicated grassroots organizer who partners with food processing and meatpacking workers across LA County to champion safer working conditions, greater dignity, and fair compensation for essential workers. We're also joined by Alice Berliner, Director of the Office of Worker Health and Safety at the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health. Alice leads efforts to advance safety in health workplaces across the county through policy, education, community partnerships, and co-enforcement strategies. She's been a longtime advocate for workers' rights and has worked with unions, worker centers, and coalitions in both New York and Los Angeles. And finally, we have Brian Justy, who you just heard from, Senior Research Analyst at the UCLA Labor Center. He completed his PhD at UCLA in the Department of Information Studies, where he studied the impact of new technologies on work and workers. At the Labor Center, he has conducted research across a range of industries, including hospitality, logistics, retail, and manufacturing. He is currently leading a project examining the impacts of artificial intelligence at the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Thank you all for being here today. All right, let's start with you, Perla. We have a few questions ready for all of you. You have been working in this industry for nearly a decade and have seen firsthand the kind of conditions workers face every day. Can you tell us just a bit about your experience working in food processing and meatpacking? Can you share a bit about what the work is like and what are some of the challenges you and your coworkers face?
Hi. Well, working in food processing is very difficult because there's so much to learn, but proper training is not given. Instead of receiving from my instruction, we're trained by more experienced coworkers, and usually that adds more work and stress to them. The job is undervalued. Workers are treated just like a number, expected to follow orders without having a voice or opinion. Some of the main challenges we face include the high-speed lines, uh, and the disrespect from supervisors, the repetitive motion injuries, and the temperatures. In some areas in the plant, it's freezing cold. In some areas, it's constant sweating. And despite the difficult conditions, the company keeps the speed. Like no matter how understaffed they are, they give us more work instead of trying to slow down so that people can catch up, um, which increases the risk of injuries and make the job even more hard. We do have a voice because of the union. Our contract allows us to participate in the Health and Safety Committee to file grievances for any violations. So yeah, it's very hard to keep up with the demands from our supervisors. We're taught to just obey. We're not like we're not allowed to have opinions because if we have an opinion, they think that we're not following orders instead of saying let them ask questions because the more they ask, the more they learn. Um, yeah, that's how it is.
Thank you so much, Perla, for sharing all of that. So much of what you said reflects, what the research is showing, right? Informal and lack of training, the hostile work environment, unsafe working conditions in a variety of ways, unsafe line speeds and unrealistic demand on workers. And to your point, even when there's not enough workers, the demand, remains the same, which is incredibly dangerous. Thank you so much. And now on to you, Edgar. You have been working closely with meatpacking and food processing workers in Vernon and other parts of LA County. From your perspective, can you share how common these kinds of challenges are that Perla just described? And if you could also add what makes it really difficult for workers to speak up.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that the issues that Perla spoke about are very commonplace. It's a part of the daily life of workers. I really do want to zero in on the unsafe working conditions that are present, and also like this general lack of training. I think this reality can be devastating to workers' lives because it leads to constant injury, right? The conditions I think that lead to injury are the fact that the production lines are operated at a very high speed. Sometimes there's frequent leaks, and exposure to hazardous chemicals to workers. As Perla was talking about, sometimes there's ventilation issues that can really make it difficult to work with heat, and even sometimes smoke builds up and makes it difficult for workers to breathe. Um, and I've heard too that sometimes workers are expected to fulfill multiple roles on the production line, right? So you're not only doing the job of one person, but you're leaning over and packing products and processing food products that somebody else should be doing, right? And so these conditions are dangerous, right? They pose a risk to workers, and I think this is why injury is so commonplace too. Workers suffer from lacerations, sometimes severed fingers, um, and the repetitive line work leads to conditions like arthritis and tendonitis, right? And sometimes it's devastating to workers, to their families, when they're out for months recovering for an injury. And sometimes these can be injuries that are disabling for longer than that, sometimes pushing workers out of the industry completely. And it's really frustrating because it's one of the few types of work that's accessible to this demographic of workers. So it is incredibly frustrating that these are the conditions that workers have to, live with. And yeah, I think it's difficult sometimes for workers to speak up because of the culture like of retaliation and harassment. Like there's a very real threat of retaliation in this sector. And it's largely to do with the staffing agencies, right? That the fact that these workers are not always permanent workers, but hired temporarily. I frequently hear about layoffs, right? Sometimes workers that have been working at a plant for years, in the way that Brian talked about, right? Like perma-temp workers, they've been working there for years, sometimes decades. All of a sudden, they're just laid off. The excuse is that there's no real need for them anymore, that production is at a lower level now. But in reality, it's usually the workers that have been speaking up that are laid off for this reason, right? So I think the fact that, people are conscious of this, it's understandable that they're fearful of speaking up and addressing some of these conditions because they know that there is that very real threat that they can lose their job and not provide for their families. So I think it is very important to address these things like these unsafe working conditions and also the fact that these jobs are very precarious for workers and it prevents them from addressing and trying to improve the conditions that they work in.
Thank you, Edgar. That really connects to a lot of what we learned earlier about the research and how these experiences are not isolated, but part of a much broader, more systemic or systematic issue. And Brian, as you shared earlier, the report really helps us understand how these individuals in individual experiences fit into a larger structure of the industry. Can you share more about what the research shows, especially around how the use of temporary staffing agencies and corporate consolidation contributes to the kind of working conditions we've just heard about and sort of the opaqueness of the industry, as you'd mentioned? And were there any findings that especially surprised you or the research team and revealed something new about how this industry operates?
Yeah, I think something that was, I mean, quite surprising to me, I think, well, to be honest with you, when we started this project, staffing agencies were sort of off our radar. And then very quickly they became the story. I mean, not the only story, but a sort of one of the main narrative arcs of this story, let's say. And I think what was surprising was, on the one hand, you can read about this in all the newspapers, and there's tons and tons and tons of media coverage of this. But food production is one of the most heavily concentrated industries globally at this point. I think there's four companies that control the lion's share of all protein production, and increasingly, non-protein food production as well. And I think what was interesting to learn and then to sort of slowly put the pieces together on was the way that at the very top of the supply chain, you have fewer and fewer and fewer companies or individuals holding more and more power. And at the bottom, at the local and regional level, staffing agencies represent sort of the opposite effect, where you have these what were once sort of maybe middle-size operations, often the site of union jobs, being splintered into this sort of vast and kind of opaque network of both staffing agencies and smaller food production plants. And so at the lower level, the local level, what we were looking at, it was really interesting to see how these effects at the top sort of trickle down and then create these particular realities for workers here. And so the staffing agency, again, is one place I guess you can see that. And something along the way that kind of occurred to me, I think that when we started learning about staffing agencies, there was, at least on my part, an assumption like, oh, the staffing agencies must be the cause of all these harms. But I think you could flip that and actually see the agencies almost as an effect of harms at like a much higher level in the supply chain. And something that we learned through sort of a more broad industry analysis was just the ways that concentration at the top lead to increasing pressure down the supply chain. And by the time you get to the local level, the margins are so thin that everyone is sort of forced to scramble, and this puts undue pressure on the workers to be sure, but also the local employers, the smaller local employers are also squeezed. And so just sort of, everything comes down to the local level. And it creates conditions ripe for, exploitation. But it's sort of as a mirror of what's happening at the top, where profits are booming up, at the top of the supply chain. Again, there's been, especially in the wake of, during and after COVID, there was a lot of coverage of this. And so I think just really being able to tie those two together and not say that these are two different things happening, but in fact, very much the same story. That corporate profits up top look like just a, sort of industry, local and regional industry totally in shambles that's putting all kinds of pressures on workers and just generally harming the community in kind of new ways. That was a sort of surprising through line, I think, that I didn't realize how intimately they were connected until, actually doing this research.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that really complex connection. Alice, I'd like to bring you in here. When workplaces like meatpacking and food processing are unsafe or exploitative, how does that affect public health? What are the broader consequences for communities and consumers when workers' health and safety are not protected, like we're seeing here in this industry?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that question. Yeah, there are a number of clear overlaps between the working conditions across meatpacking and food processing facilities and how it intersects with public health. Simply put, this report outlines how workers face a multitude of challenges at work, and we're hearing about that today as well, from lack of training when they start on the job, particularly in a language they can understand, not being provided free and necessary PPE to perform the job safely, quotas and pace of work demands placed on workers, pushing them to work well beyond what is humane, wage theft and instances of late pay, to a range of types of harassment, intimidation, retaliation when workers speak up. This industry has intentionally created a system aimed to keep workers busy and scared. And of course, this is going to have a direct impact on our food source. Your report even names that when workers, they'll often face retaliation when they identify meat that has gone bad, or were asked to pick off maggots and were intimidated to keep silent. Often consumers are more focused on food quality. Are the chickens and cows raised humanely? Do they have open spaces? Are they in clean environments? Are there added chemicals and antibiotics? But often we don't stop and ask, were the workers packing my chicken breast paid fairly? Are they provided the resources and training in a language they can understand? Can they file a CalOSHA complaint without fear? I remember when I was working at the Southern California Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health, so-called COSH, we met a group of workers from Tyson Foods in North Carolina and heard about how they had to wear diapers for fear of using the bathroom and slowing the line speeds. And to see that workers likewise here in LA County are also facing the same pushback from their employers for needing to use the bathroom, this is inhumane. I mean, not being allowed to freely sit, rest, drink water, use the bathroom, this is not only illegal, but it's also a public health concern. So when we're talking about an industry of workers subjected to these conditions and how these conditions might then be impacting the quality of the food available here in LA County, this is also, it's not just impacting LA County public health, but it's also impacting public health across the country.
Wow, thank you for sharing those insights, especially of, the distinctions in consumer insights and how they overlap with labor protections and public health. You mentioned some of the challenges around enforcement and the need for stronger systems of protection for workers. I know that one of the initiatives that has emerged in LA County includes the public health councils, especially after the aftermath of COVID-19. Could you share a bit from your perspective how the work of the public health councils has impacted work on the ground? And maybe Edgar, you could also jump in here too to share what you've seen or experienced in terms of improving safety and creating a space for workers to learn about their rights and discuss the issues that we've shared here and some of the other issues that are impacting them.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll quickly just share, our colleagues here in the LA County Department of Public Health, the Environmental Health Division, are tasked with, conducting inspections of food processing facilities and, are really responsible for preventing any possible food contamination. And then it's the Vernon Environmental Health Program who is responsible for overseeing conditions within the jurisdiction of Vernon, where a lot of these plants are. But yeah, so our Office of Worker Health and Safety, we're not specifically tasked with enforcement of occupational safety and health regulations, but we do, as you're mentioning, and engage in outreach and education to workers across low wage and high hazard industries in very close partnership with our contracted worker organizations through the Public Health Council program. And as Brian, you were mentioning before, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw how existing conditions were further exacerbated and put workers at elevated risk for contracting the disease. It's why we saw a record number of outbreaks in industries like meat and food processing, garment manufacturing, warehouse. What these industries all have in common are pace of work and quota demands, a culture of fear and intimidation, low pay and wage theft, and other tactics that are really aimed to, center profit over safety and well-being of workers. But the Public Health Council program, it was established as a partnership between LA County Department of Public Health and worker organizations, including Lane, Icasa Foundation or El Centro, a number of other amazing worker centers to really train and certify staff to then support workers in knowing their rights at work, navigating hazards and then forming councils to really develop strategies for preventing the further spread of the disease. Along with, of course, addressing other health and safety hazards contributing to COVID-19 outbreaks. But this model really leans on the worker as the expert in preventing workplace hazards and looks to the worker organizations as that trusted messenger in supporting workers in addressing and abating hazards. The Public Health Council program was also paired with an anti-retaliation ordinance to protect workers in taking action and speaking up. And we've had really amazing successes of workers forming councils and coming together and instituting change. During the pandemic, as a few examples, we heard successes of workers who formed public health councils and achieving slower line speeds, winning free PPE, which was of course their legal right to received in the first place. Receiving training actually in their language. But I think it's also important to note that these wins are often also paired with strong enforcement to ensure when a worker is filing a complaint, which can be an incredibly stressful and overwhelming experience, they are also met with care and timely response from the enforcement agency. The Public Health Council program, has continued beyond COVID-19, and we at the department really see it as a valuable partnership with CBOs and worker centers in ensuring that, when there are emergencies or disasters, workers really have access to reliable and trusted information. The contracted CBOs train workers, they host vaccine clinics, health clinics, they support in filing complaints. It's really a true partnership, but we need to ensure programs like these can continue and are expanded to even reach more workers.
And Edgar, did you want to share a bit more about your experience with the public health councils and how it creates space for workers?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think the public health councils have been so important as a space for empowerment for workers. As we talked about, like how antagonistic some of the employers can be, like these experiences can be for workers. The public health council has been so important for validating like the experiences of workers and helping them understand like what their labor rights are, right? We've done programming specifically in their Spanish, making sure that they really understand what their labor rights are and dispel a lot of the myths that workers hear from employers too, right? Not only is there sometimes a lack of knowledge, but there's deliberate misinformation that really confuses workers and distorts the reality of what they can really do to address their experiences. So, yeah, I think it's been incredible to see workers on sometimes go through like a transformation, right? Getting information that improves their life, that it improves their experiences, that also helps them uplift their coworkers and make some changes in the workplace. And I think something that's very important too is like we invite some folks from enforcement, from the regulatory agencies to offer trainings and presentations to workers. And sometimes these presenters, these reps learn as much from the workers and their realities and experiences as the workers are learning from them. And I think that's so important. I think, you know, we throughout this whole panel, we've talked about how vulnerable, this demographic of workers is because they're immigrants, because they don't speak English, some of them. And, the industry, the employers, they take real advantage of this. They know this, right? And they exploit it. And so I think it's also important for regulators to know this is the reality too, and to really familiarize themselves with the conditions and, like I said, the experiences of the workers. So yeah, I think this has been so important. The PHC, not only as a source of information, but also as a as a way to support workers as they begin to think through how they're going to address the issues in their workplace, right? Not just give them the information and let them run with it and figure it out on their own, but really work with them, talk through it, um, develop a plan, and yeah, just be there to support and to navigate these systems that can be very difficult for people to navigate on their own without any support.
Great. Thank you both for sharing more about those public health councils and how they create space for workers. As we start to wrap up, I think we'll take some time now to take some questions from the audience. So please type your questions into the Q&A chat box here on Zoom. And I believe we already have a few questions from the audience members already. We'll start with you, Brian, with a question from the audience. Can you speak a bit more to the piece rate pay arrangements mentioned, especially since piece rate schemes have been deemed illegal and prohibited in California industries like garment industry?
Yeah, well, I guess just to clarify or I guess reiterate, piece rate, we only found that piece rate is used in poultry processing, which happens in separate facilities from other meat or food production. And yeah, I guess it is what it sounds like. Workers are quite literally paid per piece or per pound by weight. We had a number of different accounts of how much workers are paid. Sometimes $3 or $4 per box, which we said this was in the video, but they need to cut a lot of chicken to get to reach the level of minimum wage. With the assumption, I guess, that they're also then working, full time to get to that point and work a number of hours and cut a number, however many pounds or whatever quantity is required. That said, the labor code is very specific that piece rate is not illegal, but it also does not exempt employers from paying minimum wage or providing meal and rest breaks as otherwise stipulated. And so what we found is that in poultry, the piece rate system is actually essentially used as a sort of catch-all for, wages. And so there's no protections to ensure that workers are receiving minimum wage. There's a number of different stories, I guess, shared in the report. Sometimes, a truckload of frozen chicken will show up, and then workers need to wait literally hours for it to thaw sufficiently so before they can begin cutting it. That is time that goes unpaid because they only get paid per piece. But the labor code, if it were enforced adequately, would dictate that that actually should be paid time. Same, with meal and rest breaks because they're paid per piece. While in some cases workers are allowed or encouraged to take breaks, they want to be able to get paid a living wage, and so they're just going to work, work, work until they get to whatever, however much they, hope to make, I guess. So it creates a culture in which workers are sort of pitted against one another. It's very individualized, and it just, workers will ultimately work. I don't know, we had workers tell us they work for 16 hours straight just to make what they deemed a living wage. So, again, on its face, piece rate is not illegal, but as was the case in garment, it just creates all kinds of opportunities for exploitation. So yeah, I think garment is a good precedent, but there are other industries as well to look to, I think, in terms of how to sort of remedy some of that.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Could you, to Alice or Edgar, could you address any findings or insights you might have about workers' compensation about after injury, and worker understanding and ability to access that system, which appears to be sort of fraught as of now?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think I spoke a little bit about some of the myths that are commonplace in this sector and how workers are kind of buy into those myths and are unaware of how to file for workers' compensation or even if they have a right to it. Um, I think that that does seem to be commonplace, but I think it's so important. That's why to educate workers, to offer trainings about what their rights are when they're injured on the job. I think the reality is that because of a lot of workers are fearful of being laid off for, filing for workers' compensation, we do usually see that until workers are laid off is when they address some of these injuries that have been building up over time. Um, so we've been supporting workers in throughout those complaints, filing for workers' compensation and making sure that they're compensated for the injuries that they've developed over time in the workplace. And it is sometimes a little bit difficult and a prolonged period for them to get the compensation because of the joint employer dynamic, because there's staffing agencies involved and a worksite employers involved too. But we have seen, some workers get due compensation, so that has been a positive experience.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And to Perla, what is one change, whether in policy, enforcement, or public understanding or conditions in the shop, that would make the biggest difference for workers in this industry?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. What is one change from your perspective that would make the biggest difference for workers in this industry? And that could be policy or something within the actual shop that you work at, enforcement, understanding from the public of what workers like you experience. If there's one change, what would you say would make the biggest difference for workers like you?
Well, we need more protections. We need to know that people understand how hard it is and how undermining it is for us. And if people understand that and they make these laws go into effect as soon as possible, that'll help us feel more comfortable in what we do. Because a lot of us are proud to do what we do. We are happy to work where we work. Just we don't get paid enough and we're underseen, undervalued. We would like more unionized people to understand that we do have a voice, we do get our point across, we are heard, but we just have to make a louder thump, louder noise, get united more, and work for these protections against our employees.
Thank you so much, Perla, for sharing that. Um, and I think for our last question to Brian and Alice, I think could really chime in on this as well. It seems that consumer safety measures are at times at odds with worker health and safety. Did you see this pattern in your findings?
Um, I I'm not sure if I fully understand what the question is asking, but I think one thing that it makes me think of is maybe the ways in which I guess the sort of welfare of worker, not welfare, but sort of the experience of workers can sort of be part of the conversation, but then I don't know, maybe I don't know. Alice sort of alluded to this earlier, or mentioned this, but consumers maybe look for the organic label or the, fair trade, these things that sort of are useful marketing tactics in the store. But there's often not the same sort of, I don't know, transparency around working conditions. And so I think about, ways in which this industry could be sort of reformed or, improved, especially locally. And one thing that we found was potentially there's, sort of some evidence of this, but there's a lot more to be done around the role of public institutions in procuring food. LAUSD, for example, buys $500 million worth of food each year. That is an enormous sum that carries with it a lot of weight and sort of dictates a lot of the priorities of those that are providing the food. And so, if there was a campaign around ensuring that workers' protections were prioritized in the conversation around where food comes from, that could potentially bring back together, along with things like, let's say, school nutrition outcomes, which obviously are, quite important and something that they're looking into. Um, you could bring together, I guess, the sort of the causes of the worker and the consumer, or in that case, maybe the parents of students, and people can find common ground. I think there's a really great initiative called the Good Food Purchasing Program that has had campaigns across the country that have done exactly this, where they sort of create this scorecard that includes things like animal welfare and equity, supply chain equity and transparency, and environmental sustainability, and they score procurement contracts based on these values. And one of the values is around workers' protections. And I think unless there's a really strong coalition that brings together each of these sort of pillars, including workers, and workers have a seat at this table. There have been examples where, a contract can score really high because they eliminate antibiotics from the chicken. To pick one example, this is something that Tyson did. Tyson had a huge contract with LAUSD. Tyson is one of the worst offenders in terms of, like union busting and undermining working conditions. But they eliminated antibiotics, and then all of a sudden the chicken was back into, circulation, I guess, with this contract. And so I think when workers are part of the conversation, we can ensure that there isn't this sort of, mix and match sort of piecemeal approach to addressing these issues, and we can have a more sort of holistic approach to reforming the food supply chain.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Brian. And I know, Alice, you had mentioned a bit about some of the contention with consumer sort of safety and health. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think unfortunately, as Brian's mentioning, buying organic doesn't always mean that it's, also means it's great working conditions for workers. And I love that you guys mentioned and also utilize the OSHA establishment database. I think most consumers don't know that they could do a quick search of a company and see whether there's been previous Cal OSHA violations, for example. So I think there is a real need to do more education to the public just about, what are conditions like across these facilities? Because I would hope and I would imagine that if consumers were to know at a, if a particular facility that they, get their chicken from or beef from is known to, have injuries among their workers, I would hope that the consumer would choose to buy elsewhere. And perhaps that would then pressure companies to do a better job protecting workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your time and for these really powerful reflections. What we've heard today really shows how central this work is, not only for workers' rights, but also for the health and safety of our communities. I also want to thank everyone who joined us this morning for being part of this conversation, and to our partners at El Centro, UFCW 770, and Lane for co-hosting today's event. If you haven't already, you can download the full report, Harm to Table, Vulnerability and Exploitation in Los Angeles County Meatpacking and Food Processing on the UCLA Labor Center's website. We're also sharing the link in the chat here. Thank you all again so much for joining us this morning.